I'm speaking with Laura Lott, President and CEO of the American Alliance of Museums.
It's very early in the morning there, I think, so thank you very much for this.
Sure, no problem, no problem. I'll try to stay awake. I just refreshed the coffee, so.
Yeah, good. Okay, I thought it would be good to start about essentially the impact of COVID, how it's affected museums in the US, and what AAM has been doing to support them. And we'll take it from there, really.
Yeah.
Let you talk.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, back in March, probably much like in the UK, museums, about 99% we estimate of museums closed pretty much overnight in over a week or so in March, and lost most of their revenue for the for most of them. So there's this misperception, at least here in the States, that museums are largely government funded or funded by a couple of major philanthropists, and that's the case for a few very well known museums, but the vast majority of museums rely on earned revenue for more than 50% of their budgets. They rely on people coming through the doors, buying tickets and going into special exhibitions and cafes and gift shops and renting their spaces even, and all of that just evaporated, went to zero overnight, and then stayed at zero for quite an extended period. In fact, there are still, I don't have a good percentage, but there's still many museums that are still closed, even 6 months later, and who, having missed what for most museums here is their busiest season, the spring and the summer, may not open until 2021. And a survey that we did shows that about a third may not open ever, or have to reclose and reclose permanently because of the extended period of financial damage to them.
That's awful. What have you had to do to support them? How have you been doing it? By networking, presumably.
Yeah, so AAM leapt into action, as most museums did, to achieve their missions in different ways last spring, and we started providing resources to help museums close down responsibly. So that was a thing that many museums hadn't had to do. How do you kind of stabilize the museum and close down and take care of your people and your artifacts and your facilities and everything else. So that was the first couple of weeks, and then it was how to reopen, and health and safety measures that museums were putting into place to reopen safely again for staff and for visitors, and training for staff. In many cases, museums had to, because a major part of their budgets are their staff, took major hits and made cuts and furloughs to their staff, and so different people were actually serving in some of the front of house guest services roles, and so training both on just how to do those jobs, and then how to do those jobs in this time of heightened sensitivity. And I don't know if this is the same in other parts of the world, but here in the States, things like wearing a mask and staying socially distant were controversial. There were folks who didn't believe that was there are still folks who don't believe that they need to be doing that. I think it's an infringement on their rights, and so museum staff were rightfully fearful about how to confront visitors with that that kind of division in our society.
Yeah, that's frightening, because they're not security, they're museum staff.
Right. So there was lots of resources that AAM was trying to provide to museums on how to grapple with all of that and make staff feel safe, and other visitors feel safe. And then the other major area that we have been continue to work on to this very morning is advocating for relief funding from the federal government. We don't have a great tradition here of federal support for arts and culture and heritage, and so it's very minimal. But we, we're successfully advocating in the spring for museums to be included in the relief package that Congress passed, the CARES Act, and the funding that came through that was really a lifeline for many museums. as this pandemic and its financial implications continue, you know, we need more relief funding, and so we are back on Capitol Hill, urging Congress to act and to include museums along with other small businesses who share a lot of the same concerns to relief funding.
Yeah, it is a very frightening time, and a lot of museums, it's largely down to their infrastructure, their actual physical infrastructure, whether they can impose social distancing, whether they can think about opening, you know, some of the smaller, tiny museums with very crowded sort of facilities aren't going to be able to open at all, I imagine.
That's true. I mean, here where I am in Northern Virginia, right outside of Washington, D.C., there's a children's science center that, you know, we as a family go to all the time. And it's been closed in part because it's just a small space. It's very hands-on. And the way that the rules are written here in the state of Virginia, you know, they really can't open until post-pandemic because they can't have enough people in the space, and they would have to close all their interactive activities, which of course is the whole museum. So
yeah, exactly. Museums have been moving further and further into interactivity, of course, and now we've got to step back from that and think of whole new ways of approaching things.
It's really interesting. I mean, even a lot of the things that, you know, I and others were, you know, preaching, you know, 7-8 months ago in terms of things that museums should be looking at, the interactivity, you know, different business models that were less reliant on, you know, philanthropy and government funding. You know, it's all been flipped on its head, and things that we were pursuing, the museums that were most ahead in those things are now finding themselves the most in trouble. So it's quite a strange time.
I wanted to ask you on a more sort of positive sort of perspective about the way it's been driving innovation, because I know a lot of museums have been thinking of absolutely brilliant ways of keeping people engaged through the lockdown and into the future.
Yeah, well, you know, disruption is always an opportunity to make change and to innovate. When we had to retool the AAM annual meeting last May, you know, in the matter of 6 weeks or so, you know, we tried to embrace that concept, and it was a tough time to embrace it since we were still all shell-shocked from what was going on. But you know, really reimagining the museum and taking this time to you know, to fix some of the to observe and then to fix some of the things that haven't been serving us well anyway as a field. So, you know, one of the big things, as you know, AAM has been trying to work on for multiple years is the lack of equity and diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion in museums. And, you know, the pandemic and the racial unrest here in the States has all shined an even brighter light on all, you know, on the inequities in our structure. And so, you know, a lot of the problems that are surfacing now have existed for a long time, but are hard to ignore at this point. And so, and so it is, you know, an opportunity to really try to address those things. And you know, and to your point about, you know, innovation on the digital front, you know, museums, you know, did immediately leap into how they could repurpose their online collections, their education resources, their expertise, you know, to reach people in a new way and to provide both educational resources for the 30 million kids who were home from school, and their desperate parents, of which I'm one. You know, to provide educational resources, engaging educational resources, and inspiration, you know, for not just for kids, but for a generally sort of traumatized public. And so, you know, in museums were, even in the midst of facing financial crisis, are sort of desperate to figure out how to serve those publics in new ways, because that's what they do. They've always been there for people in crisis, after crisis, to help folks cope, and not being able to open their doors to be that place. They've been searching for, you know, other ways to meet that need in communities, and you're right, have come up with some really wonderful things that I hope will stay with us.
Yeah, I hope so. I think in some ways it's an opportunity, in some ways it's a huge leap back, particularly in terms of when museums have started reaching out to underserved communities, and suddenly this happens, and it's a stretch even to reach out to people who are conditioned to going to museums. It makes it so much harder.
Yeah, it's interesting though. The data. So there's a group here that does research. I think it's annually called Culture Track, and they've done a special research project this year to talk about, you know, the museum's response to, you know, to the crisis. And one of the data points that I found most intriguing that I know they're going to dig into in sort of round 2 of the research is that there's some data that shows that the online audiences for museums here in the States are more diverse than, you know, racially and ethnically diverse and socioeconomically diverse than the in-person audiences. And so I think that that's you know, well, you know, obviously the access to high-speed internet and you know, a lot of other things are still a barrier for many in our population. The audiences are more diverse, and I think that's a hopeful sign and something that we have to figure out as a field to how to hang on to. And then I think, you know, there are museums that are really showing evidence of their social capital, their spaces that, you know, schools are using or parents are using to, you know, provide internet access and childcare and some, you know, activities for students who are in some cases, in many cases, still home from in-person school. There are, you know, there's several different science centers who are handing out lunches to, you know, children who typically rely on the school system for at least a couple of their meals a day. And so the science centers became, or, you know, the museums became places for those families to pick those meals up. And they also got science kits while they were there, you know.
That's
so
fantastic.
An educational activity. Yeah.
That really is.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of, you know, real innovation where museums are demonstrating that they're not just nice to have places to go, you know, when it's a rainy afternoon or families in town or something, but they really are integral to the community, that they have a lot to offer, that they have one of the biggest commodities right now, which is space, in many cases. And that they want to serve the field, the communities in what they need.
Exactly. How do you see that in terms of the future? Do you see these changes lasting? Do you see museums shifting and science centres and all the rest shifting to become core parts of the community?
I hope so. I mean, I think that that's where we have been moving for the last couple of, at least the last couple of years, probably longer, is the museums, and I'm seeing the museums that are the most connected to their communities, even you know, pre-COVID, are the ones that are strongest right now. They're the, you know, they're the ones that moved right into, okay, how do we serve in this environment? They're the ones that people are, you know, standing up to support. They're the ones with the, you know, membership lines out the door when they do reopen, because people can't wait to get back into their beloved place. And so I think there's real evidence that's going to be hard for the field to ignore, about the power of that, you know, social capital of that, you know, museums really being part of society, whether it's the education system or, you know, or other aspect, healthcare, other aspects of what communities need.
That's fantastic. That really is. Yes, they've stopped just being custodians of the past and become something about the free future, present and the future, and something more dynamic.
That's right. That's right.
How can museums armour themselves in the future against this sort of thing, against this sudden cut-off of revenue? What about the structure?
Well, I think that this, you know, this becoming part of the community is a major way that museums armor themselves against, you know, the kind of financial challenges they're facing right now, because when they are integral to the community in all sorts of ways, there are mechanisms, not the least of which is just the public standing up to make sure that they survive. You know, and I think they, you know, when they are not as relevant or not as top of mind for the communities, that's when they can, you know, they can really be at risk. And so I think this, this being really part of, being relevant, being part of the community, serving the communities in different ways is a big part of protecting themselves in the future. And I'll still, continue to say, diversifying their revenue sources so that they're, no matter what the nature is of the financial crisis, they're not reliant on one source of income. And so, whether that's, taking a museum that's very reliant on ticket sales and building, the other, another side, monetizing, in small ways, some of the digital content and digital programming that they're doing right now is a big challenge and opportunity, I think, for many. But we do need to look at business models, even though some of the business models that we were looking at before are the ones that are challenged right now. It's still something we need to pay attention to.
Absolutely. Just finally, I'd like to retouch on the diversity issue again. Obviously, even in the UK, we've seen a huge sort of, the feeling that culminated in Black Lives Matter has driven an enormous amount of change in museums in terms of tackling sort of decolonizing museums, for want of a better expression here. How is that impacting in the States? How is that going to drive change in the States?
Yeah, well, I think that the turning point right now is a move away from words and what I'd call window dressing, some of the really big gestures of inclusion and change and equity that are really just above the surface and aren't really going deep into the institutions. And there's more recognition that the institutions are accountable or being held accountable by their staffs, by their artists, by the public, to do the real work, to follow up those words with real action. And that action is not, it's got to be sustained, and it's not very sexy or glamorous. I mean, it's hard work. It's looking at the composition of your board. It's looking at your policies and procedures and the ways that just the ways that museums were founded have been built and reinforced some of the inequities that we say we're against, but haven't actually dug deep to fix.
Yeah.
So I think there's, I've seen some really great, 13-point plans come out from museums that I really, where they're dedicating budget to these issues, where they're dedicating, expert staff who do have background in critical race theory and other things that are needed for, to actually lead and sustain this work in institutions. We are honestly overwhelmed with calls for support and help right now, with the DEAI work that we have been doing, diversity, equity, accessibility, inclusion work that we've been doing, and trying to figure out how we can, meet that need with, everything from, training to toolkits to template inclusion plans to that on just coaching, the coaching that many of our leaders in particular need to deal with the tough issues that inevitably come up as you dig deep into
very much so.
Really closely held beliefs and policies.
That's fantastic. Right, thank you very much, Laura. It's been brilliant to talk to you again.
Oh, it's great to talk to you, Lala. Thanks again, and I'll look forward to participating in the conference.